Chapter 23. The Horns of War. Again. Sera was pretty sure her heart stopped beating. Her hands tightened until her nails dug into her palms. The echo of Rollo shouting Bill's name resounded in her ears. "There's no way," she thought, as her pulse stuttered and began to gallop. From behind her, she heard someone whisper, "Sera?" The voice was just as she remembered it, causing her cheeks to heat and a smile to break across her face. He was not only alive, but she got to see him again. It was beyond her wildest dreams. She was already calling out his name as she spun on her heel and came face to face with a man who looked to be as old as her uncle. His hair thinned around his temples, and wrinkles crowded the corners of his eyes. She choked on his name. Of course he was older, her mind tried to reason. While she'd just left him no more than 20 minutes ago, he'd lived an entire life apart from her. She heard herself cry out as her eyes blurred with tears. Bill reached out a hand toward her, tentatively, but it was the way a father might move to comfort a child. Sera turned and fled. She didn't get far into the woods before reason pulled her up short. It was dark and she was near a battlefield. It was stupid of her to continue running. She pressed her back against a tree and sank to the ground. Blindly, she stared at her hands in her lap. Less than an hour ago, Bill had twined his fingers through hers. He leaned toward her, and she thought she might be about to experience her first kiss. Her stomach twisted as her brain warred between the two timelines, trying to orient her. She heard Bill coming even before he called out her name softly. She closed her eyes. His voice really was exactly the same as she remembered. For a moment, she was convinced he'd appear as he'd been before. But when she opened her eyes, he stood there, still so much older. He sat down next to her. "This is strange, isn't it?" he asked. She could only nod. "I thought about you after..." He took a deep breath and ran his hand through his graying hair. Such a familiar gesture. "In my mind, you were growing older, just like I was. Seeing you now, exactly how you were when you left." He trailed off. Sera forced a swallow. She couldn't bring herself to meet his eyes. "What happened? The last I saw, you'd been hit by an arrow." "I got lucky. It was a clean wound. Didn't hit anything important." He eased the collar of his tunic aside, and in the soft glow of the night, Sera saw a puckered scar. "Rollo was able to fend off the rest of Siegfried's men. He waited until dark to take me back to the camp and dress the wound. That's when we put two and two together and realized that his great-grandfather is the one who saved my great-great-great-uncle. Once we realized all we had in common, I joined up with him. I thought Siegfried would be angry after Rollo let you guys escape, but once Rollo told him that there was a lot of land worth plundering down the Seine in Burgundy, and that he'd let Siegfried have it all, that seemed to smooth things over. Then they went their separate ways, Siegfried and his men carrying their ships overland to farther down the river, and Rollo staying behind outside Paris for a while, until King Charles the Fat finally paid him to leave." He picked up a stick from the ground and began to break it into smaller segments. "It feels like it was ages ago." After a pause, he asked, "How has it been, saving the future?" Sera still didn't lift her eyes. "We haven't been. When we realized Vicky had hitched a ride, we came back here to return her. She swallowed with effort. "I thought you'd been killed trying to save my life." He reached out and lifted her chin with a finger. "If I had died for you, it would have been worth it. The cause of the historians means everything to me." She realized then that's what she'd been to him. Not a girl he liked, but a part of a larger cause that needed protecting. She stood abruptly. "I need to get back to the others. We shouldn't even have come to this time. It's dangerous to interfere." "Wait," He stood, but age had made him slower, and she was already several steps away. "There's something you should know." Her shoulders tensed. She just wanted to leave, for this whole night to end. She wanted to remember Bill as he'd been before, not this stranger. "You told me that in order to fix the break, the Vikings had to be kept away from Normandy, right?" he asked. Sera nodded, without turning to face him. "If Siegfried went to Burgundy instead, then we did our job." "Siegfried recently changed his mind," Bill said. "That's why we're here. Rollo's trying to fight his way into Normandy by way of Chartres, but he lost the battle today." Sera spun toward him. "Dak said Rollo won Chartres. That's why we came here." Bill shook his head. "We lost today, Sera, and this was Rollo's last chance to get ahead of Siegfried." "We have a problem," Dak said, as soon as he saw Sera striding back into camp. She didn't look happy to see him, but that had never stopped Dak before. "If this is about cheese, so help me." "Rollo lost the battle today," he said, keeping his voice low. Dak still couldn't get over the changes in his Viking friend's appearance. Where before he'd strode through camp with his wide shoulders thrown back and chin high, now he slumped forward on his stool, staring at the fire. Every now and again, Viggy would nudge his hand with her nose, and he'd smile down at her, but Dak knew that his defeat earlier today had been a crushing blow. And it shouldn't have happened. It wouldn't have if Dak, Sera, and Rick hadn't been mucking around in history. By getting Rollo involved, they'd practically ruined his life. Dak glanced around the clearing and lowered his voice even more. "Rollo said the Franks have surrounded the hill. They've completely cut him off from water. And his ships. If they attack, he has no hope of fending them off." Rick strolled over just in time to hear this last bit. "Then I'd say now would be a fine time for us to fire up the Infinity Ring and catch the first warp out of here." "We can't," Sera said simply. For once, Dak and Rick were on the same page as they both stared at her with confusion. "Come again?" Rick asked, taking the words right out of Dak's mouth. Dak noticed Sera glancing over her shoulder to where Bill hovered around the edges of camp. "It's worse than you realize," she whispered. "Worse than being sitting ducks for an army 3 times our size?" Dak asked. She leveled her gaze at him, and Dak's stomach sank. He knew that expression. It was the same one she'd worn just before their 4th grade science fair, when she'd found out she wasn't the only student who'd thought of using demotic technology to monitor household energy use. "Siegfried's marching on Normandy, and there are other SQ Vikings behind him, ready to take his place if he falls," she said. "Rollo is headed there to try to stop them, but the Franks have this hill surrounded, and if he can't find a way out, he won't be able to confront Siegfried, and will have failed to fix the break." Chapter 24. Old Enemies. If there's one thing that always calmed Sera, it was losing herself in the intricacies of physics. The world could be falling apart outside, and with all the earthquakes, tornadoes, and hurricanes roaring about it in the 21st century, it sometimes was, and she'd never notice. She'd always had the ability to focus in on problems with a laser-like precision, and she hated nothing more than failing to come up with a proper solution. After all, she was the girl who'd stayed up for 2 days straight, figuring out the previously unsolvable Yang Mill's existence and mass gap problem. But now, she didn't have 2 days to figure out a solution to their situation. She was lucky if she had 2 hours before dawn came and the Franks attacked. Rollo and his men had been arguing much of the night, Dak interjecting at times, trying to figure out how a few thousand Viking warriors could fight their way past tens of thousands of Frankish and Burgundian soldiers. They'd all come to the same conclusion. It wasn't possible. Every avenue of retreat had been cut off by the Franks. Even though the fleet of Viking ships floated less than a league away, it might as well have been the distance to the moon. Yet a feeling in Sera's stomach told her she was missing something obvious. She stood from the fire and walked slowly through camp. Everything was so quiet and subdued. nothing like their previous battle experience, full of urgency and hasty preparations. A part of her missed the noise. Even though it had been terrifying at the time, there had been something thrilling about the clanging Parisian church bells and the blaring Viking horns signaling the start of battle. Sera froze, one foot still suspended in the air. "That's it," she said out loud to no one. She laughed at how perfect of a solution it was as she raced back to Dak and Rollo. She was winded when she found them in front of the fire. "The horns," she blurted excitedly. "We may not have enough men to fight the Franks, but they don't have to know that. Dak, Rick, and I will sneak into their camps with battle horns and start sounding them. The Franks will assume they're under attack and scatter. In the confusion, you run for the ships." She beamed with pride. Rollo scowled. "I'm not sending kids into the enemy camp," he grumbled. Dak bristled at being called a kid, but before he could complain, Sera piped up. "No one would ever suspect the three of us," she argued. "If the Franks find a Viking wandering in the woods, they'll get suspicious, and everything will be ruined. But if it's just us—" She shrugged. "We're kids. How much trouble could we be?" Dak was glad that before leaving the Viking camp, he'd finally been able to change out of his wolf pelt, replacing it with dark leggings and a thick cloak pulled from an injured Frankish soldier. His familiar axe still rested at his hip, and in his hands he carried a large war horn. Clouds had rolled in while they debated the details of Sera's plan. Now, even though dawn was imminent, the night was pitch black, which made navigation rather difficult. Dak had never been a particularly graceful individual, and not being able to see where he was going wasn't helping matters. Every step he took seemed to bring with it a cacophony of cracking branches that caused him to jump, which only set off more noises. After finally agreeing to the plan, it took a lot of arguing. Rollo warned the three time travelers not to get too near to the Frankish camps. They'd likely have guards posted, he warned, and they couldn't risk getting caught. At first, Dak obeyed this command, but the longer he waded out past the edge of the camps, the more restless he became. After all, he was a historian first and foremost, and he saw it as his duty to properly record what he witnessed throughout time. He'd already begun drafting his magnum opus titled The Time Lord, which he was quite sure would establish him as the preeminent authority on all things historical. Besides, it was boring out in the woods alone. His mind made up, not that he took much convincing, Dak moved toward the Frankish camp. The closer he got without anyone sounding an alarm, the bolder he grew. He kept himself tucked low as he advanced through a collection of lean-tos, pausing every now and again to listen to the snores of the soldiers. His heart pounded with a mixture of fear and excitement. Dak was just peeking his head into a crudely built cabin when he heard the first horn blow. Sera. The sound sputtered at first, and then gained in volume and urgency. Another horn joined in. Rick. Already the sound of mumbling and surprise drifted among the soldiers scattered throughout the tents and bedrolls littered around the camp. A few men popped to their feet, weapons already drawn. There was no time for Dak to sneak back out to the thick woods, and so he did the only thing he could. Hunkered down behind the nearest tree and blew his horn as hard and loud as possible. It looked easier than it was. At first the instrument only let out a wheezing, choking sound. Dak's cheeks began to blaze hot and red with the effort, his head spinning with lightheadedness as he heaved in another breath. He changed the shape of his mouth, and that did the trick. The horn let out a horrid, piercing wail. Whoever hadn't been woken by the other horns was certainly awake now. Soldiers sprang from their bedrolls, some of them yanking on shoes, some of them reaching for weapons, but most merely fleeing. "The Northmen are attacking!" Dak yelled, encouraging their panic. "Retreat!" His warning spread like wildfire, and Dak heard it repeated again and again. Soldiers scrambled, fleeing the camp so fast that Dak couldn't help laughing in between bouts of blowing the war horn. The ruse had worked. The Frankish army was in disarray, which is exactly what the Vikings needed to break toward the river. He couldn't wait to meet up with Sera and congratulate her on such a brilliant plan, especially since he'd never really been convinced it would work in the first place. With a smile on his face, Dak turned toward the cover of the forest when a hand suddenly clamped on his shoulder. Dak reached for his axe, but he was disarmed immediately and found himself pinned to the ground, staring up at the dawn-tinged sky. A figure hovered over him, sharp knee digging against Dak's ribs.
"If it isn't my old nemesis," the man said, "you don't seem to have aged a day."
He hauled Dak to his feet and dragged him toward a fire. As the light spilled over the man's face, illuminating the scar that slashed from his left eyebrow to the right corner of his mouth, Dak felt his insides twist. Even though the past 25 years had added wrinkles and age spots to the soldier's face, Dak recognized Gorm instantly. The aged man yanked Dak's hands behind his back, tying them tightly with the length of rope he'd been using as a belt. "You don't have to do that," Dak muttered. The Time Warden barked out a laugh.
"That's what the man and woman said, too. And since they were older, I believe them. That's the last time I trust anyone from the future."
Dak's heart froze. He swallowed. A man and woman? From the future? It could only be his parents.
"Head still hurts from where the woman conked me with a rock," Gorm grumbled.
Then he gave Dak an evil look.
"I'm not taking any chances this time."
Chapter 25. Inheritance. Suddenly, nothing mattered more to Dak than getting back to Sera and Rick. And if that meant leading the Time Warden right to where Rollo and his men were clambering into their ships, so be it. He had to tell Sera about his parents. If the knot on Gorm's head was as fresh as it looked, they'd been here only an hour or two ago. They could still be here, somewhere. It took everything Dak had not to start calling out for them in the dusky dawn. If the Time Warden was suspicious that Dak offered only a half-hearted resistance before giving in to his demands to be taken to the Vikings, he didn't show it. Instead, he just trudged along behind Dak, recounting how losing the time travelers in 885 had caused Siegfried to banish him and how miserable his life with the Frankish army had been ever since. Dak didn't care, and he barely listened.
"Siegfried took my sword, leg-biter," Gorm grumbled. "Do you know what it's like for a Norseman to have his weapon taken from him?"
When Dak didn't answer, Gorm prodded him in the back to elicit the correct response. Dak shook his head.
"Humiliating. Leg-biter was my father's sword and his father's before him. And what do I have to pass on to my own son?"
Dak glanced back at the Time Warden, wondering if his son had inherited his thick nose and drooping ears. If so, he should be glad to get nothing else from his father. Another shove to the back, and Dak mumbled, "What?" He tried not to think about what Sera and Rick would say when he led the enemy into their midst. He was being stupid, and he knew it, and yet he didn't turn back.
"Nothing,"
Gorm barked.
"That is, until I trade that magical metal device to Siegfried. You take me to camp, you give me the thingy, and maybe I let you live. Deal?"
As if to emphasize his point, Gorm swung his axe through the air, cleanly slicing a thick limb from a nearby tree. His message was clear. If things didn't go well, that could be Dak's neck. He shivered, trying to shake off Gorm's all-too-real threat. When Sera realized what Dak was doing, she was going to be so ticked off. But that didn't matter to Dak right now. What mattered was figuring out how to find his parents again. "He should be here by now," Sera hissed. She walked in tight circles along the shore of the misty Air River, while Rick sat along the bank, skipping rocks across the water. It was a cloud-choked morning, and the stones sailed into the gray before sinking. "It's Dak," Rick answered. "I'd be surprised to see him again before noon." Sera whirled on him, crossing her arms over her chest. "What's that supposed to mean?" One of Rick's rocks sank into the water with a loud sploosh. He lifted a shoulder. "Only that it's Dak. We let him go alone to an enemy camp. I figured we had a 50-50 chance he wouldn't do something stupid and get caught." Sera felt her blood boil hot in indignation and then drain from her cheeks in worry. "Dak's smarter than that. I'm sure he learned his lesson last time," she said. "When hasn't he gotten in trouble? Alone or with us? Look, I understand the dude's fascination with history. This whole trip must be like a field day to him, but he's not exactly smart about avoiding risks and taking precautions." Sera wanted to argue. She even opened her mouth, ready to defend Dak. But nothing came out. The truth was, Rick was right. With a huff, Sera turned her back and resumed her pacing. Just downriver, Rollo and his men were piling supplies into their tethered boats and preparing to cast off. With so many men, it would be a long and involved process, but if Sera, Rick, and Dak wanted to be with them when they left, they had to be ready soon. It wouldn't be long before the Franks realized that the Viking attack had been nothing but a ruse, and then they'd regroup and come after them. She really didn't want to stick around to see what an enraged Frank looked like in this century. For a while longer, Sera began to pace, and then she stopped in front of Rick. Losing Dak wasn't the only problem occupying her mind. "Do you think getting Rollo out of here is enough to fix the break?" she asked. Rick just shook his head. "And you're basing that on—" Rick looked up at her, and she glimpsed something familiar in his eyes. "My remnants are getting worse," he confessed. Sera winced. "That bad?" Rick tried to laugh, but the sound came out forced and choked. Sera sat next to him, watching his face closely. "You never told me what your remnants were about," she said. Rick scratched at the ground, searching for another rock. "There's nothing really to say about them. Nothing concrete I can describe." "Mine were like that too, at first," Sera said. "They were just feelings, but eventually I started to understand what those feelings meant." She hesitated before prodding. "What's the feeling you get from yours?" Rick pushed himself to his feet and stretched, throwing his arms high overhead. "Nothing," he said when he was done. Sera hated the attitude in his voice. "Fine, if you don't want to share, then don't." She stood and walked away. "I'm going after Dak," she said. Chapter 26. Caught. Dak gritted his teeth in frustration. He didn't care so much that his hands were tied behind his back, or that the Time Warden now carried Dak's axe, or even that his parents might be nearby, but he didn't know where. All of those things he could deal with. What angered him was that he'd just heard a familiar voice call his name. Sera had never been one for subtlety, and she crashed around in the forest sounding like his Uncle Dick after eating Aunt Lou's world-famous six-bean casserole. Dak tried to cough every time he heard her voice to distract the Time Warden, but that only served to make Gorm send strange looks his way. Dak could hear the edge of panic in Sera's voice. It was careless of her to be wandering around in the woods looking for him. There was a Frankish army on the run. What if she stumbled on them instead? Eventually, Gorm figured it out. He jerked on Dak's arms, pulling him to a stop.
"Sounds like your friend's worried about you," he said, nudging Dak with his elbow.
Dak fumed, but when the Time Warden raised the axe to Dak's neck and ordered him to call out for Sera, he had no choice but to obey. "Sera Frost!" he shouted, hoping that by using her full name she'd be suspicious and figure something was up. They really should have figured out some sort of code word for situations like this, though perhaps it would be better to try avoiding situations like this altogether. Sera was one of the smartest people Dak knew, other than himself, of course, but she was more of what he'd call book smart rather than street smart, or in this case, forest smart. So he shouldn't have been surprised when she came crashing through the underbrush, winded and unarmed. The Time Warden was delighted to see her.
"Well, now it's getting interesting, isn't it?"
She drew up short, her eyes going wide as she glanced from Gorm to the axe to Dak with his hands tied behind his back. All she said was, "Uh-oh." "Uh-oh, indeed," Dak thought. Now all they needed was for Rick to join them, and it could be a party. As if summoned by Dak's thoughts, the older boy stumbled into the clearing, just as unarmed as Sera. "Oh, for the love of mincemeat," Dak muttered, using Sera's favorite phrase. She glared at him. "You didn't bring any weapons, or perhaps a Viking or 20 as backup, did you?" Dak asked hopefully. At least Sera had the decency to look sheepish as she shrugged and said, "All the men were busy." Great, Dak thought. Now Gorm knew no one was coming to rescue them. This morning was getting worse and worse. Which, of course, is a phrase only uttered moments before things do indeed become worse. Gorm knocked Dak to the ground and stepped forward, resting the axe against Sera's stomach. Using delicacy that Dak never could have thought possible with such an unwieldy weapon, the Time Warden sliced the leather sack from her belt. The infinity ring had been their last bargaining chip. Now that it was in the Time Warden's possession, the 3 time travelers were completely out of options. For a moment, Sera wondered if perhaps her luck had run out. She'd already come up with one successful ruse tonight, and she wasn't confident she'd be able to pull off another. She was pretty sure that fear showed on her face, which is part of why it was so easy to convince the Time Warden that she and Rick were the only people in the woods coming after Dak. Also, technically, that was a true statement. Not that Sera was one for lying, but she was very much a stickler for details and precision. Dak had asked her if there were any Viking men assisting them with backup, and she was quite confident in answering no. But that didn't mean she didn't have other tricks up her sleeve. She hoped. Even so, feeling the sharp edge of the Time Warden's blade against her and watching as he plucked the infinity ring away was quite worrying. What if she'd miscalculated? If the next few moments went wrong, the 3 of them could lose all ties to the future, fail in their quest to fix the breaks, and even possibly lose their lives. The Time Warden pulled the infinity ring from its bag and sniffed it before putting it between his teeth and biting. Pretty much everyone in the clearing winced at the sound of a tooth cracking. Hydroxylapatite-infused bone really isn't much of a match against titanium, Sera cautioned. The Time Warden glared at her and raised his axe. She took a hasty step back, but wasn't fast enough. Gorm grabbed her by the arm. Her gaze shifted to Dak, and what she saw there made her remaining confidence waver. He was well and truly terrified, and, with his arms tied behind his back, there was nothing he could do to defend himself, or her. Rick tried to step forward and situate himself between Sera and the Time Warden, but that only made the older man angrier and caused him to push the blade against her throat. With every swallow, she felt the keen edge of it, and her mind couldn't stop cycling through just how much force and pressure it would take for him to sever something important. He was nervous, that much was clear, and Sera knew well enough that a man on edge was liable to take desperate measures, especially since he had the infinity ring in his grasp. Something shifted in the woods to her left, a dark shape creeping through the darkness. Seeing it, Sera's heart began to pound wildly. This was her chance, the moment she'd planned for. She had to take action, and she had to do it now. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and crossed her fingers, hoping that her luck hadn't run out after all. If she failed, it wasn't just their lives at stake, but the fate of the world. Chapter 27. Admitting Defeat. "Viggy!" Sera shouted. She pointed her finger at the Time Warden and added the command, "Dinner!" For a moment, nothing happened, and Sera's breath hitched as her lungs felt impossibly tight. Growing up, Sera's uncle had never allowed her to have a pet, and so she'd always looked at dogs and cats with a certain amount of puzzlement. She didn't understand why someone would invite a wild creature into their home and attempt to interact with it on a daily basis. But over the past day, she'd begun to understand the bond between a dog and its master, especially after seeing how desperate and depressed Vigi became when she was separated from Rollo. Not to mention the way the Viking chieftain's eyes lit up when he saw his beloved beast again. It was like watching a father reunite with a long-lost child. At this moment in time, though, as Vigi propelled herself into the clearing, Sera could have kissed that dog, horrid breath notwithstanding. The Time Warden didn't even have a chance to prepare himself before the massive beast leapt through the air, tackling him to the ground and placing her mouth around his throat. He froze as Vigi's teeth pressed gently against his skin. Sera noticed Dak wince. He'd already told the story of being pinned by Vigi the first time he met her and how terrifying the experience had been. "You hungry, girl?" Sera asked, enjoying the look of panic on Gorm's face. She wasn't sure which was worse for the man, the dog's teeth at his throat or her breath so close to his nose. She ran her hand along the dog's bristled back in thanks as she bent to snatch the axe from the Time Warden's hands. It didn't take long to slice through the ropes binding Dak's hands behind his back. Newly freed, Dak knelt to give Vigi a good scratching behind her ears. The dog's tail swung happily through the air in response. "Are you going to behave?" Sera asked, looming over the fallen Viking. "Or shall I let this fine dog enjoy her meal?" The man's face burned red.
"I'm not the only one, you know," he hissed. "Kill me if you want, but there are others like me after you, and none of them have a reason to see you kept alive. You don't even know what mistake you've made here today."
Sera started to answer when Dak leaned in close, all playfulness draining from his face. "Where are my parents? The couple you saw earlier? Where did they go?" It was such an unexpected question that Sera gasped. Apparently, her reaction was all the Time Warden needed. A slow grin broke across his face. In response, Vigi's jaws tightened ever so slightly, making the man wince. Sera glanced at Dak, urging him to look up at her. Usually, they had the ability to almost read each other's thoughts. There were times they were so in sync it's like they shared the same brain, albeit his tended to focus on more esoteric historical details while hers was firmly rooted in scientific fact. Now, they were almost like strangers. Sera couldn't begin to guess what was going through Dak's mind. The expression on his face, a mix of despair and rage, was one she'd never seen before. Gorm chuckled.
"So it seems there might be something the young time traveler wants after all."
Even with his life at stake, the Time Warden managed to lift one eyebrow.
"What are you willing to trade for that information?"
In the distance, she heard men calling out orders, the Frankish army regrouping and setting off toward the Viking encampment along the river. They were running out of time. "Dak," she said, plucking at the edge of his cloak. "We have to go." When he looked up at her, his face was twisted in desperation. "It's my parents, Sera. I know you don't understand, but—" He must have seen the way his words dug into her heart, because he trailed off. Rick cleared his throat then, making his presence known. He knew enough about Sera's remnants to realize how much Dak's words stung. She did understand what it was like to miss your parents. Every time her stomach twisted and the world tilted into a remnant, that's what she felt. She was always aware of the gap in her life left by her parents' deaths. "Let's go," Rick murmured. Sera knew he was right. The Franks were drawing closer, and if the Time Warden was telling the truth, more SQ cronies were embedded in the army coming after them. She tugged harder at Dak. He hesitated, and then she felt him give in. Vigi stood her ground, keeping the Time Warden pinned so they could get away without being followed. As the three time travelers ran into the woods, the man shouted,
"You can't escape the SQ. Through time and space, we'll always be a step ahead."
The three of them didn't say much as they fled upriver toward the fleet of Viking ships, which suited Dak just fine. He'd been impressed by Sera's quick thinking. Even he'd been duped by her ruse, but that couldn't take his mind off his parents. They'd made it to the band of Vikings and were being escorted onto one of the ships when Dak stopped short, holding Sera and Rick back. What if Gorm actually knows where my parents are? We might be leaving the only real lead we have to finding them. Men bustled around them, loading up the ships and setting their shields along the strakes for protection. The first light of morning was still struggling just above the horizon, and a soft mist curled up from the surface of the river. Rollo's ship had already pushed from the bank and unfurled its sail, the crisp dawn air making the bright red cloth flutter. He let out a sharp whistle, calling for his dog. "The fact that he saw your parents only confirms our theory about the breaks," Sera said, out of breath from running. He could tell she was trying to be patient with him, though an edge still crept into her voice. "They're drawn to the breaks. If we don't find them here and now, we'll have another chance. I just know it." Dak wanted to believe her, but this wasn't supposed to be a break, he told her. "We went back to 885 to fix it. We were never supposed to be here. In fact, we wouldn't be here if it weren't for Viggy." Instead of responding, Sera strode toward one of the ships and let a burly Viking boost her on board. "Wait!" Dak called after her. The boat was packed with people and supplies, and Dak had to thread his way through large men preparing to cast off. When he finally caught up with Sera in the bow, she wouldn't meet his eye. "What aren't you telling me?" he asked. "I think the historians sent us to the wrong time in the first place," she answered softly. "I don't think we were ever meant to be at the Siege of Paris, after all." Chapter 28. Learning from Dogs. Dak could tell how much Sera disliked admitting that they might have made a mistake, and apparently Rick felt the same. He scowled. "I decoded that clue correctly," he told them. "I may be younger than Brit and Mari, but I understand the art of memory and how to use it. It's just like any other language," he grumbled. Sera sighed. "I'm not saying you were wrong, it's just—" She ran a hand through her hair and seemed surprised to find it so short. She frowned, and Dak remembered how much she'd loved her long hair. Her uncle had once told her it made her look like her mother. He hadn't realized just how much she was sacrificing when she allowed Gloria the historian to cut it off during their first mission. The ship pulled away from shore. Men bent over the oars to push them against the current. The movement jolted Dak, and he grabbed for the nearest bench to steady himself. Already he could hear the sound of the approaching Frankish soldiers and see shadows of armed men running through the trees along the riverbank. "I think that Brit and Mari might have gotten it wrong," Sera told him. "Which means we can't rely on the square nearly as much as we have been." Dak felt entirely too exposed and vulnerable, even though the river around them was filled with ships, each one teeming with Vikings aiming bows and arrows toward the shore. "We really don't know what we're doing, do we?" Sera cringed at the question. He knew Sera hated when she didn't know something, and it was even worse when someone pointed it out, especially a friend. Rick stepped forward, his hands fisted. "We're doing the best we can," he said. "Sera saved your butt more times than I can count, even when you didn't realize it. We were under a lot of pressure to warp away when you were out gallivanting with the Vikings, but we didn't." Dak tried to catch Sera's eyes, wondering if this was true, but she avoided his gaze. "Whatever," he eventually mumbled. "Let's just get to the next break and start looking for my parents again? Is the ring already programmed?" Sera and Rick traded a glance, something Dak was getting really tired of. He hated feeling out of the loop. She took a deep breath. "There's a problem with that," she started. "My remnants have been getting worse. Rick and I both think it means we haven't fixed anything yet." "But we kept Siegfried from controlling Normandy," Dak argued. "Now his descendants won't conquer Great Britain and establish dominance throughout Europe. Isn't that what we were supposed to do?" "We just delayed the inevitable. Now Siegfried is going to Normandy by way of Burgundy instead of Paris. The result is the same." Sera began to pace. It's what she always did when she was frustrated that a solution to a problem was escaping her. The SQ knew what they were doing when they aligned with the Vikings, Rick added. They're crazy good warriors. If they want Normandy, they're going to take it. Even if Rollo gets there first, they'll just end up fighting him for it. And since our remnants haven't gotten any better, it's a pretty good bet Siegfried and his men will win. We had our chance to fix things before, and we blew it. As far as I can tell, there's nothing we can do to stop the SQ now. Giving up was not a phrase in Sera's vocabulary, but her scientific mind required that she base her actions on facts, and those were starting to add up against her. Everything should have led Sera to the conclusion that they'd failed, but she just couldn't believe that. She'd identified a 10th dimension in string theory because she'd been unwilling to give up, and she wasn't about to start doing that now. That still didn't mean she had any solutions to their current predicament. She saw Bill pushing his way through the men on the ship, finding his way to her. Her stomach twisted every time she looked at him, trying to reconcile the Bill she knew before with who he was now. He was an old man, and she couldn't figure out how to relate to him. The day before he'd been a friend and confidant. Now, she didn't know what he was now. She turned away and looked out over the water so that she didn't have to meet his eyes. We have word that King Charles the Simple's army is marshalling troops upriver, and the Franks are regrouping behind us, he told them. They'll both be striking out for us soon. It won't be safe here much longer. Rollo intends to fight, but even if we're successful, I'm afraid we don't have much hope of stopping Siegfried's forces. You may want to move on before things get messy. Yeah, Rick quipped, because warping into yet another war zone is so appealing. Dak seemed to ignore him, as usual. What's the king doing in this part of France? Sera rolled her eyes. Leave it to her best friend to turn any moment into a quest for more historical knowledge. Oh, he's been trying to draft some sort of treaty between the Norsemen and the Franks to keep them from constantly fighting, but so far he's been unsuccessful. Bill continued his history lesson, Dak hanging on every word. But Sera was distracted by the sight of Vigi loping up the riverbank alongside them, licking her chops as if she'd just enjoyed a fine meal. Rollo's boat was at the head of the mass of ships, its sail full and oars slicing through the water. From the helm, the giant Viking chieftain let out another piercing whistle that caused the dog's ears to perk and flick in his direction. Vigi's muscles bunched, and she raced toward the river, claws digging through the mud. She didn't even hesitate at the water's edge, just dove in with a splash and began to paddle furiously, the tip of her tail weaving through the water behind her. Rollo laughed and called out encouragement as Vigi drew closer. When she reached the edge of his ship, he leaned over and plucked her from the water, not caring that he almost capsized the boat in the process. Even from where she was standing, Sera could hear the way Rollo crooned to Vigi, letting her sopping body settle in his massive lap as she licked at his face happily. Every time her tail swung, it sent out an arc of water, drenching the men stationed at the oars, but neither dog nor master noticed or cared. Sera couldn't help but smile. Even though they'd risked screwing up the timeline by warping here to return Vigi to her master, it was worth it to see how happy she made the Viking chieftain. And he deserved to have his dog back after he'd done so much to help the 3 time travelers. As soon as that thought crossed her mind, Sera gasped. Of course. The solution was so obvious that she started to laugh hard enough for tears to leak down her cheeks. When she caught her breath, she realized that Dak, Rick, and Bill were all staring at her with concern. She suppressed a few more chuckles and cleared her throat before announcing, We've been looking at this the wrong way. I figured out how to fix the break. They continued to stare at her, eyes wide with expectation. She turned to Bill. They'd need his expertise to make it work. How quickly can you get us to the king? Chapter 29. So close, so far away. Sera couldn't stop beaming. They'd been looking at the problem all wrong. Rick had been right. There was nothing the 3 of them could do to keep the Vikings from occupying Normandy. So the solution was obvious. They had to pick the right Viking to take charge, and Rollo was the perfect candidate. It was brilliant in its simplicity, and best of all, it involved making peace instead of war. Even though it had been her idea to approach King Charles the Simple with the idea of granting Rollo the land that would one day become Normandy in exchange for his promise to protect the mouth of the Seine from further Viking attacks, it had been Bill who'd pulled it all off. They'd known there was no way the king would listen to 3 kids, and Bill knew that the fate of the world rested on his ability to get this deal done. He'd been hesitant to accept the task at first. He explained he'd always seen his role as historian as being to keep records and support the time travelers, not to take such an active role. But as a native Parisian who'd spent decades among the Vikings, he was the perfect ambassador. It had taken the entire boat trip up the river to the king's camp to convince him, but in the end, Sera was the one to get him to agree. After that, it had been a long and tense ride. The boats were crowded, and Sera spent the entire time anxious about the impending meeting. She knew her plan was a long shot. Why would the king even accept an audience with them, much less agree to their proposal? After all, according to Dak, Charles the Simple ruled over the Franks. He owned the river they were traveling on, the land along the banks, and everything she could see. At the same time, she saw no other way to fix the break. They had to secure Normandy and the lineage that would rule it. She trusted Rollo, and she trusted Bill to convince the king of what they needed. Once they arrived at the edge of the king's camp, they spent several tense hours waiting to find out if they could even speak with anyone who might listen to their ideas. They could all just as easily been taken prisoner. Sera tried not to squeal with glee when a dour-looking set of soldiers led their small group to a large, ornate tent with smoke drifting from a peak at the top.
"It's the king's tent,"
Dak whispered out of the corner of his mouth as the flaps were pulled aside and the soldier motioned for them to enter. That was pretty much the point at which Sera's mind went blank. She knew she'd stood before the king, and she remembered being proud of the way Bill's voice didn't tremble, even when her hands shook so hard she had to grasp them behind her back. At first, the king balked at the idea of ceding away so much land to a Norseman, but Bill explained that Rollo would swear fealty, making himself a subject of the king and bound by his laws, something Vikings rarely ever did, and promised to guard against future Viking invasions by stopping them from entering the Seine. The king was tired of Viking invasions, which made it that much easier for Bill to persuade him to sign off on the deal. They thought that convincing Rollo would be another matter entirely, but when they approached him with the solution, he merely shrugged.
"I was getting too old for plundering anyway," he'd told them. "Besides, now that I've got Viggy back, I figure it's time to give her a better life and settle down."
While everyone else had started celebrating the new arrangement, Sera found a quiet spot and pulled out the infinity ring. "Whoa, whoa, whoa!" Dak said, holding up his hands and stepping out of reach. "Not so fast! Rollo's becoming a duke tomorrow and invited us to the ceremony. That's something I'm not going to miss." Sera rolled her eyes. "We're not warping through time just so we can attend a few parties. There's a cataclysm we're supposed to be preventing, if you'll recall." "I don't see why we can't do both," Dak offered, raising his eyebrows and giving her a hopeful smile. "Are you forgetting that there are time wardens after us? They know what we look like, too," she countered. "We'll wear disguises," Dak suggested. "It's been a rough few days. Think of this as a morale booster." Sera glanced at Rick, who shrugged. "Fine," she finally said. "We stay for the ceremony, and then we go. But Dak's in charge of finding us all costumes." Dak started dancing around the clearing in celebration. It wasn't a pretty sight. Dak couldn't stop hopping from foot to foot. He hadn't been this excited since he'd unearthed that cache of rare coins from a hidden drawer in a famous antique desk. It wasn't his fault the museum had such poor security. "Can you believe we're actually here for this?" he whispered to Sera for the 20 millionth time. She glared at him from under a large, drooping hat and a tangle of horsehair meant to look like a wig. Her clothes were bulky and dirty, giving her a sloppy, misshapen appearance that wasn't helped by the smell. She didn't look pleased, but Dak figured that the worse they smelled, the less likely people would spend enough time around them to realize who they were under the disguises. He gave her an innocent look in return. She'd put him in charge of procuring disguises. She should have known what she was getting herself into. Even her discomfort couldn't dull the excitement thrumming through him. It was just all so real. The king's men had been working all day to craft a throne and a dais for the ceremony to take place on. A crowd had started gathering early, but Dak had dragged Sera and Rick to the location just beyond the river before the sun rose. He wasn't going to miss a minute of this. The procession began with the blaring of horns and the arrival of important guests from nearby villages and towns. Rollo's men were peppered through the crowd, an odd mix of those who, not too long ago, had been fighting against one another tooth and nail. Speeches were made, descriptions of land and boundaries rattled off, and as the ceremony proceeded, something began to seem amiss to Dak. There were moments when he felt like someone was staring at him, but when he glanced through the crowd to find out who it was, there was no one looking in his direction. The uncomfortable sensation grew as the long day dragged, and it began to feel like a weight on his shoulders. He found his mind wandering, his focus diverted from the details of what was going on around him. On the stage, a minstrel was singing a ballad, but Dak's attention was drawn to a group of men gathering on the far edge of the crowd, near a copse of trees. They were growing rowdy, and something about it piqued Dak's interest. "Be right back," he murmured to Sera, and before she could say anything to stop him, he'd slipped through the throng and disappeared. He had to fight against the surging crowd, everyone pressing forward for a view of the dais, as speculation that the king's arrival was imminent drifted from mouth to mouth. Dak kept his gaze focused on the crowd growing around the disturbance, forcing his way nearer. As he approached the commotion, his heart started to pound faster, his stomach twisting with an anticipation he didn't understand. The mob had their hands raised, shouting out curses. Dak asked the closest Frank what was going on. "The devil's spawn, that's what they are!" the man hissed before turning and shouting that they should burn the pair. He heard a woman cry out, "No!" and then someone else, a man, shout, "Leave her alone! Get back!" His blood froze. He knew those voices. "Mom! Dad!" he yelled, elbowing people out of the way as he battled his way forward. It was slow going, the crowd packed so tight that he had to resort to crawling between legs at times, not caring when someone's heel crunched his fingers. All around him, people surged, their faces twisted with rage. Dak had forgotten how superstitious most people were during this time period. Science, as he knew it, didn't exist yet. Anything unexplainable was chalked up to magic. As he drew closer, he caught glimpses of his parents. They both brandished what looked like rifles from the American Revolutionary War. And rifles wouldn't be invented until the 19th century. No wonder the crowd was going nuts. "Hold on!" he shouted, shoving two people out of the way. "I'm coming!" Just as he reached the center of the circle, his parents flickered like a TV channel losing reception. "Wait!" Dak cried out. His mother stretched out her hand, and Dak reached for it. When he closed his fingers, it was around nothing but air. Dak's parents had been pulled out of time. They were gone. Chapter 30. Left hanging. Once again, Dak was missing. "Where is he?" Sera hissed at Rick. She felt like she should have this question printed up on a placard so she could just wave it around whenever necessary. Rick scanned the crowd half-heartedly before turning his attention back to the dais, where a man read the terms of the Treaty of St. Clair-sur-Epte. Rollo and the king had finally taken their positions. "I'm sure he just went off to find a better view. But I don't see him." She pressed her hand against the infinity ring tucked under her bulky cloak. Throughout the day, she'd caught glimpses of Gorm wandering through the crowd, and he wasn't alone this time. It was making her anxious. The ceremony started, and it's not like him to miss it. Maybe I should go look for him. She just started pushing her way through the crowd when she heard a rumble of an argument followed by a collective gasp from those around her. She spun toward Rick. What happened? He looked stunned, which was unusual for him. The bishop said that Rollo should kiss the king's foot as a demonstration of his fealty and a thanks for the gift of the land. He turned to face Sera. Rollo said he'd never bend his knee to anyone or kiss anyone's foot. If he refuses, the ceremony will end without him being appointed the Duke of Normandy. Sera started feeling slightly panicked. They were so close to fixing this break. They couldn't let it all fall apart now. We can still fix this, right? Rick said. Sera nodded, slowly. I think so, if we hurry, but figuring out what it would take. Rick was already on his feet and pushing through the crowd before Sera could finish the thought. She stood, trying to follow, but the gaps Rick created in the crush of people closed too fast, and she was brought up short again and again. From her left, she heard someone shout, and a man with an SQ insignia stitched in his collar began to force his way forward. He pointed directly at her and called for backup. They were so busted. Again. Sera swallowed her alarm and concentrated on her efforts at catching Rick. She made it to the front of the crowd, but was too late. He'd already leapt up the steps to the dais and was beyond her reach. "Rick!" she hissed, but he couldn't hear, and she didn't dare risk drawing more attention to herself. The Infinity Ring was already pre-programmed for Washington, D.C. All she had to do was find Dak and grab Rick, and they could get out of here before being nabbed by the SQ. Totally easy, she thought, rolling her eyes. Rick didn't even appear to hesitate as he strode across the dais to where Rollo towered over the king, both of them gesturing heatedly. Sera caught snippets of the argument. The king's bishops demanded Rollo show fealty. Rollo flat-out refused to humiliate himself by kissing another man's muddy boot. When he spoke, Rick's voice rang clearly over the crowd, silencing everyone. "We can agree that the king wishes for Rollo to occupy the city of Rouen, stretching to the sea, including the mouth of the Seine River, correct?" Shouts of agreement came from the Vikings in the crowd. "And we can also agree that in exchange for such generosity, Rollo shall give fealty to the king and defend Francia's borders, can we not?" This time, the Franks in the audience cheered their approval. Rick knew what he was doing. This crowd was not going to be happy if the treaty fell through, and now both Rollo and King Charles knew it. "In fact," Rick continued, turning to the two leaders, "a treaty to such effect has already been agreed to, correct?" After a slight hesitation, both men nodded. "What's he doing?" someone muttered in a familiar voice, and Sera scoured the crowd until she found Dak standing on the other side of the aisle leading to the platform. They'd strung chains from posts to keep the crowds at bay, and there was no way Sera could cross to Dak without drawing a whole lot of unwanted attention. "Where have you been?" she demanded loud enough that a few surrounding men grumbled for her to be quiet. She noticed that Dak's eyes seemed a bit wild, his body almost vibrating with tension. She had no idea what would cause him to be so agitated, and she was afraid to find out. Over his shoulder, deeper in the sea of people, Sera saw a pair of SQ agents pushing their way toward the dais. She pointed them out to Dak, and he ducked, slipping through a few people to better hide himself. Sera did the same. Whatever Rick was planning, he'd better hurry up, or they'd all be in big trouble. Rick continued with his speech. "All that remain are the formalities, and I think that both parties can agree to assign such duties to those trusted men among their ranks. Right?" If the king was unhappy with the idea, he didn't show it. Once Rollo gave his assent, the king followed suit. With the flourish of someone who'd obviously spent a lot of time on a stage learning how to woo a crowd, Rick turned to Rollo. "May I have the great honor of representing you for such an honorable act?" Rollo frowned and shrugged. Rick turned back to the king. "And will you accept my substitution on this fine Viking chieftain's behalf?" The king looked toward his men, clearly lost as to what was going on. Sera had to press her hands to her mouth to keep from giggling. Even though it was clear to her that Rick was overdoing this, the crowd was eating it up. Eventually, the king waved his hand ambiguously. If he'd been expecting Rick to kneel and lower his head to the ground, he was wrong. Rick stepped toward him and took the king's muddy boot firmly in his hand. He then raised it to his mouth without bending over and, with loud exaggeration, kissed it. Clearly, the king was not flexible enough to have his leg lifted so high, and he tumbled backward and off the dais. Rick turned and beamed. "The king's foot has been kissed, and Rollo's fealty given." The crowd gasped. There was silence. And then someone snorted. Somewhere else there was a stifled giggle, a cough, and before long the entire crowd was roaring with laughter. The king's attendants helped him to his feet, and Sera saw a flurry of emotions cross his face. Bewilderment and frustration at first, but he softened at seeing the amusement of the crowd. The king smiled, apparently deciding that he needed to look like he was in on the joke. Sera was so caught up in the moment that she wasn't prepared for the hand that clamped on her shoulder and the voice shouting, "Hey, you!" Sera jumped and screamed, the sound lost in the noise from the crowd. The SQ agent shifted his hand from her squirming shoulder to a long shank of her fake hair. "You're not getting away again," he threatened. She grinned, stepping sideways and out from under the horsehair wig. "That's what you think." Without a second thought, she ducked under the chain blocking the aisle and raced toward Dak, grabbing him and pulling him to where Rick stood on the stage, surrounded by a band of cheerful Vikings. "The SQ is onto us," she yelled to him over the noise of the crowd. "We have to get out of here." Rollo must have seen the urgency on her face and known what it meant, because once the two of them had climbed the stairs and joined Rick, he and his men closed rank around them, facing outward with their weapons drawn. "Yo, Rick," Dak said, holding out his fist for the older boy to bump it. "That was pretty awesome what you did with the king." Rick grinned, obviously pleased by the compliment, and returned the gesture. "My time-traveling friends, you're leaving so soon?" Rollo asked. Beside him, Vigi whined, her forehead furrowed. Dak scratched at her ears. "I'm afraid so," he told the new Duke of Normandy. "Though this time, I think we'll leave this lady at home." Rollo clamped his hand on Dak's shoulder. "You're a strong warrior, smart and true. Thank you for the gift you've given me. I will keep the SQ with a Franco-Viking out of Normandy for all time, and I promise to turn away from pillaging and do well by my station as Duke. Mostly." Dak's face blazed bright red at the compliment, but Sera knew he was loving every minute of it. She pulled the infinity ring out and started double-checking that everything was set correctly. The last thing she wanted to do was let a last-minute miscalculation send them zooming too far ahead in the future or drop them into the middle of another war zone. Beside her, someone cleared his throat, and she looked up to find Bill. "So, that's it, then?" Sera hesitated, and then nodded. He cleared his throat. "I ran out of time back in Paris before I could give you this. I'd meant to then, and I've held on to it, just in case." He pulled a length of fine chain over his head and held it out to her. A gold charm dangled from the end, and she reached out to cup it. It was a tiny infinity symbol, delicate and smoothly polished. "My ancestors were goldsmiths, and they passed down the skills." Sera felt her throat tighten. "Thank you," she whispered. "I wanted to thank you, actually," he said. That took Sera by surprise. "For what?" "For being brave," he explained. I'd have never done anything big in my life, taken any risks, if I hadn't learned that from you." Sera sputtered. "I'm not really that brave, and I hate risks." In response, Bill smiled. "Maybe you don't see it yet, but I do." Just then, Rick stepped forward and linked his arm with hers. "Our work here is done," Rick announced. "On to 1814. One war of 1812 coming up." Dak placed his hand on her shoulder after kneeling to allow Vicky to give him one last slobbery kiss. Sera took a final look around her and smiled at Bill as she pushed the button to send them swirling through time. The infinity ring began to vibrate, the scene around her blurring. Her body felt small and impossibly big at the same time. "One more thing?" Dak whispered, just as everything began to shatter apart. "I saw my parents. They were here, and then they warped out in front of my eyes. But not before they left me this." The last thing Sera saw as medieval France disappeared was Dak holding out a large iron key. This is Dion Graham. We hope that you have enjoyed this production of Infinity Ring, Book 2, Divide and Conquer, by Carrie Ryan. This program was produced and directed by Scott Sherritt. Executive producer, Paul R. Gagney. Original music by Susan Jane. Text and production copyright 2012 by Scholastic Inc. All rights reserved.